to our talk, Circle Time, Understanding Restorative Justice and its Practices in the Classroom. Our speaker today is Roxana Kazemi. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, Kazemi, about the same.
Kazemi, okay, thank you. Roxana holds a Master of Science in Couples and Family Therapy from Virginia Tech. As a couples and family therapist resident, she provides couples, family, and individual therapy to clients in Virginia, currently through a local private practice under the supervision of a licensed professional in Virginia. In addition to providing therapy services, she trains and assists individuals, communities, schools, and organizations on how to implement restorative justice practices. Roxana is an AmeriCorps service member alumni. She enjoys avocados and teaches Pure Barre. So Roxana, we're really delighted to have you here. I heard you speak at the National Conference for Mental Health America and really thought that what you had to offer would be relevant for our community, and that this would be a nice follow-up to our last webinar that we did on social emotional learning. So we are delighted to have you here, and welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm ready to get the ball rolling, I think, if everyone's ready. So I'm going to share my screen. Lisa's got the chat. I can see it too. She can see it probably a little faster than I can, but I'll probably share the screen and then stop sharing the screen. So feel free to chat, and we will definitely have time for lots of questions at the end, or if you just kind of want to share thoughts, we love that. Also, all right, well, how about we do it? What do we think? Well, so what we're going to talk about a little bit today is restorative justice. This is very much like an introduction to the topic. This is really so we can just have that little like sampling is kind of what I like to call it. So you get a little taste of restorative justice and what that kind of looks like. And then you can kind of see if it's something that you like and you want to learn more about. So none of us will leave being a restorative justice expert. This is just a really nice way you can kind of sample the topic, and we'll hopefully kind of have some really small ways that even today you can feel that you can start kind of being more restorative in your practices. So this is me, that's me, I'm here. And I am a marriage and family therapist resident in Virginia. I'm part of a private practice in Northern Virginia. I live in I would say a pretty populated suburb of DC, and I've been in this area for a long time. So that's kind of my home base. That's what I do now, and I'll tell you a little bit about like how I got here. And I always love when people chat to each other in the box too. So especially if you see someone who does something that sounds interesting to you, definitely like, please chat away with each other also. So a little bit about then what is going to get us to restorative justice. Well, the first thing is we want to talk a little bit about something that's called zero tolerance behavior management systems. So many, many words, but let's just kind of break it down. This is one of the most common forms of behavior management that is taught. So we're kind of looking at the classroom setting today because I used to be a teacher before I became a therapist. That was what kind of sparked my interest also in therapy, was a lot of the struggles that I had as a teacher. And we're going to talk more and more about those struggles. But a big thing when you go to a class, even a parenting class, things like training to become a teacher. I did AmeriCorps, so that was where I had content knowledge from my undergraduate degree. And then because you have that content knowledge, you then can take like a exam basically to then be able to have a license to teach. So you go to like a crash course, basically, of being able to become a teacher. So as you can probably predict, how well did that go for me with a crash course to become a teacher? Not very great. So one of the things that they teach us is zero tolerance behavior management systems. So a big thing of this is that it's very clear, like on paper, right? So a big thing of it is, if you do this, the consequence is this. If you get out of your seat in class, you will get a demerit. So I'm going to use some examples from my job when I was a teacher. So we used a demerit system. So you could earn merits, and then that could be used to, like, we had a little like school store. You could go get like a fun little eraser, little things like that. If you wanted to maybe earn a field trip, your merits would do that for you, but you also earned demerits. And really, I would say the demerits were such a big focus compared to the merit system. Now, we really tried to do the merit system, because that's also a way zero tolerance like sounds really helpful. If you do these other things, right? If you turn your homework in, you get a merit, you get like a positive point. So that's more like that positive behavior intervention systems in schools. So let's use getting up out of your chair. That was considered a Rome when I was a teacher. So if you get out of your chair without permission, that is a demerit. You will get a Rome demerit. If you get 3 demerits, you will not have recess at lunch. If you get another 3 demerits, you will not have end of day recess. If you have even more than that. So recess was a big thing because I was with 5th graders. So 5th grade, like they're still kind of on the little side, even though I was in a middle school, our 5th grade group, they still had recess. So in theory, this sounds really good, right? But where does this come from? So this is not actually unique to just schools. Zero tolerance is the idea that we have discipline policies, practices. This is going to mandate a predetermined consequence, typically severe, usually punitive, and often very exclusionary in response to specific types of student misbehavior. So regardless of the context or rationale for the behavior, we don't really care in zero tolerance why something happens. We care what happened. So that's going to be really important for later, the what versus the why. A big thing of zero tolerance is it doesn't emphasize rehabilitation or proactive support. So it's very exclusionary, but doesn't do a lot to be inclusive. Right? Where does this come from? So we see this kind of pop up in the 70s. The Reagan administration uses it with the quote, war on drugs. And we now see this very popular in response to minor criminal offenses, school disciplinary infractions. This in the 90s, later kind of calling it 3 strikes and you're out. Things like mandatory minimums, part of zero tolerance. So it really is all over our community, if that makes sense. So there's so many different ways that we interact with zero tolerance behavior management systems and sometimes don't even realize. Right? So let's just like go over it a little bit and then I'll check in with you guys. We'll zoom out, zoom in. Why then, if it's this horrible thing, right? Like, surprise, spoiler, right? Zero tolerance is not the best way. But then why are we doing it? It's very common to teach because think about it, like on paper, it makes it seem like the answer to all my problems is if I just do 1, 2, 3. So when I was a teacher being trained pretty much in a summer, like to be prepared to go teach 5th grade social studies, right? And at the time I actually was teaching math. I was teaching summer school math, bilingual math. And then somehow doing that was going to prepare me to teach social studies. You're going to see a lot of holes in this story of clearly how we were set up for success, right? But in theory, like you get this thing and they say, hey, if you do this and then this, like you're going to be okay. But a big thing of zero tolerance is also this idea of control. Like we have to control people. That there's this idea that if we're all not kind of equal partners and active members in our community, even a classroom community, that there will be chaos. And I'll tell you, another spoiler alert is we had to use zero tolerance policies, the merit to merit system, because I worked at a public charter school. That was the system for the entire school. My classroom was chaos. So the very thing that I had been taught that would bring like order and, you know, really effective learning to my classroom, it wasn't happening. So in theory, it's super easy to learn and to do, but in practice, zero tolerance has a lot of inequity because it's impacting mostly youth of color, particularly Black boys. So a big piece of this inequity that really we have to wrestle with is that very similar infractions, let's use the roaming example, just getting up out of your seat, right? Yield different punishments for children of color. So in a classroom, if there is a white student, let's use boys because that's where the data really shows the very horrific inequity that there is. A white boy is more likely to get a reminder from their teacher rather than a punishment. A Black boy is more likely from their teacher to get the punishment, to actually have the zero tolerance enacted. So I might tell a white student, if I'm the teacher, like, hey, remember, we don't get up out of our seat. The Black student is more likely to be told, you're out of your seat, that's a demerit, right? So this is where things like our own implicit bias like really can show up, right? So on paper, yeah, you would think, oh, everyone is going to be treated equally. But what to that I would say is what is fair is not always equal, which is what we're going to talk about with restorative practices, just trying to be able to think a little more contextually. Because zero tolerance doesn't ask any questions as to why something happens. It just tells us what happened. But I really believe nobody wakes up, particularly children. I mean, at least I don't even now. Nobody wakes up and says, I want to have a bad day today. I want to not be successful. I don't want to thrive. I don't know anybody. I don't have any clients who I see who wake up and think this way. I never taught any student who thought this way. I don't know any families that of the students that I taught, of the families that even I work with now, nobody wakes up and says like, oh, I want to be a bad kid today. No, they don't, right? So this is why context is so important, because we want to understand why when, you know, what I call maybe more unhelpful behaviors are happening, why are they happening? Because I really think nobody wakes up and says, I want to break the rules. I want to be in detention. I want to be in trouble. So this thing that is so easy to learn on paper, in practice, there's a lot of inequity in it. So restorative justice emerges to try to offset this inequity, right? To look at the damage that's been done from zero tolerance practices in so many different spaces, right? Across industry, restorative justice emerges like we need to do something. We need to do something different, right the wrongs, especially structurally, that are happening. So a big thing of restorative justice is we start to think about the context of behavior, which is really what we're going to focus on today, kind of understanding context, because you cannot be successful at restorative practices, actually like doing kind of like those big things that people see. The big one is the restorative justice circle people see online. They're always like, you're the circle lady. And I'm like, yeah, kind of, right? But a big thing of it is you're not going to have a successful dialogue. You're not going to have a successful restorative justice circle. You're not going to have any of that if you can't think contextually. So restorative practices at the core of it, it's facilitating that dialogue between the injurer and the injured parties. right? So between the people who were in an interaction, I'm going to talk about some classroom examples. But like I said, if we want to really be restorative, we need this paradigm shift in how we think of discipline. So what I'm going to show a little bit today is of something called contextual family therapy. So if you work as a clinician, right, there's lots of modalities of therapy: CBT, DBT, contextual family therapy, structural family therapy, solution-focused therapy, Gottman method of couples therapy, emotionally focused therapy. This one is big in kind of the MFT kind of community. It's not a popular one that's necessarily taught because it's much harder to kind of manualize in a way. But I think there's so much that's powerful of this modality, of this theory, that's going to help us have, hopefully today, start having a little bit of that paradigm shift, because there is something incredibly healing about experiencing that paradigm shift. And I know at least it did for me. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the principles of CFT, contextual family therapy. I'm just going to call it CFT. We're going to look at how we can apply these principles so we can understand those zero tolerance practices and their limitations. We really want to try to promote this paradigm shift to the contextual perspective. And we want to work to hopefully eventually become more and more restorative in our practices. So these are the few things we're going to focus on today. When I work with people like over many days, weeks, months, maybe even years, honestly, many hours, I break this up into modules. And even to some extent, I do this as a clinician with my clients, right? It's kind of like those treatment goals. So I break it up into 3 things. This is what we're going to focus on today. We want to be able to really try to understand like zero tolerance practices, particularly in schools, like that merit demerit system. We want to just start to be able to think contextually, right? To distinguish what is more like a zero tolerance practice or perspective, right? That's kind of the what. And then a contextual perspective, right? That's thinking about the why. Today, kind of thinking about students. And then just to start to think about, ponder, let it simmer like a soup, how we could use something like restorative justice practices, incorporating context, and what that could do in the communities that we're in. So we'll kind of zoom out in just a second, but let's kind of talk a little bit about CFT, right? So a big thing is this approach comes from Naj's model, his theory, contextual family therapy, CFT. The biggest thing that CFT does that is so wonderful is that it helps us identify and address the root of conflict in systems, the core of why conflict is happening, not just the what. So what I love about CFT in particular is these 4 pillars. So this, I call it kind of the contextual framework for today. The 4 pillars of CFT, first is that we want to understand the facts. We want to look at the perspective of individuals, those systemic patterns of interaction, and relational ethics. This is the framework we're going to use to hopefully have those first steps in that paradigm shift. And hopefully you kind of feel it today. Like I almost think it's like a bodily experience when you kind of start thinking contextually. It's really full mind, body, soul experience. And we're going to try to use these 4 pillars to help evaluate behavior management scenarios and ways we can put it into practice. So we're going to talk a little bit more, and I'm going to hopefully show just a little sprinkle of what this actually looks like. And so I'll probably zoom out now. So what I want us to just kind of think about together, would love people to chat or share. I'm not sure if people can even like verbally share, but would love that too. What ways maybe the behavior management systems that you currently use or teach, or maybe even just experience yourself, in what ways maybe have some of those been helpful? And also maybe in some ways, even if you don't interact with these systems as much, in what ways are some of these behavior management systems not as helpful? So for me, a big thing of zero tolerance that I found really helpful was it was easy to learn. And I loved that part. So I don't know if anyone wants to put into the chat. Yeah, large groups, that's an awesome one. Yeah, a lot of shaming of students as behavior management systems. For me, that was a big one when I was a kid. Like a child would be used as an example. Sometimes it was me. So it would be like a wee naughty. I like to kind of toe the line. Maybe like a couple more if anyone's got one, or if someone shared and they want to add a little more. But I think, right, it's not this evil thing, zero tolerance. It's not. A big piece of it is exactly, Carl, what you wrote, right? Like in a large group, if we have like a really clear management system, we can get content delivered, right? Be a really effective teacher, right? Oh, the clip charts, Vicky. Oh, we're going to talk about the clip charts. I am really excited for that. That's a great example. So like when I was a kid, we had a like stoplight system. If anyone also like, if we can trauma bond over that, like in the chat, I would love that. So we all had our names, especially like when I was young. So if you work with younger children, maybe you've seen this one where everybody had a paper clip, right? So it's like Roxanne was here and we all started the day on green. And then as the day went, you would move up, right? Up to yellow means like that was kind of your warning. And then red, there was, you know, usually some type of consequence, no playing. And exactly these kind of behavior management systems, they sound like really good in theory for like big groups, particularly maybe if everybody has, you know, a homogenous like experience, right? Really similar identity markers and lived experiences in particular. But I don't know about you guys, like I don't know too many people who have exactly the same lived experience. So it's just something to think about. Like, this is not an evil practice. Like, I hope that, you know, maybe you see like, even just from me, right? Like I was taught these practices. I like to think like I overall like seem nice, right? But in practice, these zero tolerance behavior management systems, they're not working. And so let's look a little bit then about what is context, right? Because we want to start thinking more contextually now. So what is context? These are the underlying unique circumstances and the environment that influences an individual, micro level, really small, or even societally, structurally, that's the macro level, right? Things that we want to start thinking about just today, right, are things like SES, demographic characteristics, education levels with families, like what people's employment looks like, the history of the community maybe that we serve, the history of maybe even the country that we're in, which this one in particular, right, it's got some stains in it. And especially people's lived experience. This, if you work with trauma, crisis, those lived experiences, right, are so powerful and can have such a profound impact on us. And I really believe that individual behavior is influenced by these contextual factors in our environment, in our history, right? Nobody wakes up and says, I want to have a bad day. I want to break the rules. I want to be successful. Sort of like the whole minimum wage. I don't know anybody who says, I want to make minimum wage. Everyone who I know, they want to make maximum wage as much as possible, right? So context, what we're really looking at is these intersecting, compounding impact of all of these factors, right? So how does my demographic characteristics, how does that show up? So like for me, I grew up in a immigrant Persian family. So both of my parents are from Iran. I was born in the United States. I was born in Oklahoma. Then we made our way to Northern Virginia, right? So the family that I grew up in looks very different than, let's use my spouse as an example, right? He grew up in more New England area, much more rural, and has two Caucasian, like a very American parents who also lived in New England, right? So we grew up in a lot of ways, like very different. But if we never think about context, we're never going to really understand like how those differences show up, right? And this is where really that cultural humility is so important, right? Part of cultural humility is being able to think contextually, and the idea that these factors can be sources of strength, right? That they're not something that inherently are disadvantages to have, right? When we ignore this context of what makes every single one of us complex and important and unique, we are failing to understand the root cause of where, quote, misbehavior even comes from. So I want to tell you a little bit about when I was a teacher. So you saw me at the beginning, you see me now. This is also me. That's me. That's me. And I want to tell you a little bit about some of the students who I taught. And I want to tell you a little bit about how being able to start thinking contextually really helped me. I like to say I was a really good, very bad teacher. So I want to tell you about 3 students who I had, all of whom, them and their families, I still keep in touch with today. I actually talked to a couple of them just a few days ago. So I want to tell you first about Dejanae. This is Dejanae, right? She was like my angel. Why? Well, she was pretty, like kind of like quiet and reserved. So she reminded me a lot of like some of my friends who I have, like, we kind of are rule followers. If you kind of tell me to do something, like I'll kind of do it. I usually like meet expectations. And she was super helpful. She like really like followed all of the rules, right? So it was easy to love her. It was really easy to love her. But I have to push myself to also think about why was it so easy to love her? One, we were kind of similar, right? And just like personality, some of those contextual factors we have in some shared lived experiences, different things kind of like that. So we had commonality, so it made it a little easier for me to love her. She also followed the rules. So operating, you have to remember, right? We're in that zero tolerance system. We're not in an environment that uses restorative practices. So someone like Dejanae, like, yeah, we love her because she follows the things that you ask, right? She was the like ideal for those rules. You tell her, do this, this is the reward, do this, this is the consequence. And honestly, 8, 9 times out of 10, she's doing exactly what you want. But that isn't raising cooperative children, right? That's using compliance. And to really think about that, we're trying to have a paradigm shift where we all are cooperating, thinking contextually about one another, rather than trying to control each other. Because nobody needs to be controlled. No community needs to be controlled, and certainly in a classroom setting. That is not where we are as the adult in the room trying to control anyone. So in that way, Dejanae was compliant, which is part of why I really liked her. And then in one of the other classes, right? So I was in a middle school, but had 5th grade. So they had little homerooms named after usually the college that their homeroom teacher went to. So my undergrad was at George Mason University in Northern Virginia. So if I had a homeroom, it would have been the George Mason University homeroom, probably would have called it GMU. So Dejanae was in the University of Oklahoma homeroom. Go Sooners for anyone else who's tied to Oklahoma. Larry and Javon were in the Fordham homeroom. So this is Larry. So a big thing of if any of you have done community-based work, maybe even working in a public charter school like I did, a big thing is kind of home visits and really immersing yourself in the community. So for Larry, still is a very talented football player. So they called him Big Baby. And is literally, we are the same size. And now he is much larger than me, which is, I don't like to think about because I like to remember them as little people. But Larry, I never really reach him. And that's okay. I can own that. Right? Larry was difficult to love. Right? He was my friend who I had to try to love the most. Why? Because we were so different. Right? Larry was loud. Larry was not, quote, compliant, right? So you said to do something, he wouldn't often do it, would need many, many gentle reminders, aka demerits, right? So he would shout out in class, just in the middle of class, would just scream something out loud. If he got frustrated, sometimes he would throw things, right? So it was very difficult to love Larry. But I want you to think about, and I think about a lot, what it is like then to be Larry and to come to school where, like, you know, I'm not gonna lie, I'd be like, Larry's absent today, like my class stands a chance of being successful, right? Like, I was like, oh my God, I can't even believe I'm thinking this way. But what's it like then to be Larry? Where people have kind of those thoughts about you. Would you want to come to school? I wouldn't. Would you want to participate if people kind of think this way of you? I wouldn't. And I still keep in touch with him and his family, and he's doing really well. They're all doing really well, right? And that's the power of when we shift to think contextually, like how these ruptures in relationships or difficult relationships, right, how they can really blossom. I taught lots of kids. I don't keep in contact with every single one of them, but a decent chunk of the families, Larry's is one of them. So how was I able to do that? Where we can have this kind of relationship now outside of the classroom, because I haven't been in the classroom now for years and years. Right? Thinking contextually, Javon is right here, also in the Fordham homeroom. Javon was kind of like, I can call him like a, you know, like a on and off again, like ex-boyfriend. So sometimes, you know, they're really nice to you and you're like, I love them. And then sometimes they do things and you're like, why are you doing that? But then they do something nice again. And then you're like, oh, like, yeah, that's why I like you, right? They take you on an emotional roller coaster. Some days Javon would offer to clean the entire classroom. Like he'd be like, I am staying, Miss Cosme, I'm going to clean your entire room, right? And I never asked him to, or he would give me like so many hugs, right? He would really want to help, which like as a struggling teacher, someone who's like, I'll help you organize, I'll help you clean, I'll help you hang up these posters. Like, yeah, you love that. I'm like, wow, that's like really helpful, you know? Like, I would love that. And we know like being able to spend quality time with children, like can be really helpful in forming a connection, because where there's a strong connection, children are going to feel more connected to us and more likely to respect and really hear what we're sharing with them. But then the very next day, right? So Javon, my helper, who would really like transform my classroom, the next day in class, he might then tear down poster on the wall, the poster that, you know, we hung up, right? And I would stay hours and hours after school to try and prepare something and put all these decorations up. And Javon would get frustrated about something, but wouldn't quite tell me what that frustration was. And so then he would rip down the decoration maybe for that lesson. And honestly, like I would cry. Like I think I cried every single day when I was teaching 5th grade. And I took it so personally, right? Kind of the failure that I had as a teacher. And especially when there would be a rupture in a relationship, let's say with Javon, because one day we felt so connected, we would play together, we would just like talk about like life and things. And I was like, oh, like this is, this is the rewarding part of teaching. And then the next day, like desk flipped, chair thrown, posters ripped down, and I couldn't understand it. And this is why to really start to think contextually was where I found a lot of personal healing, was to really, instead of saying like, look at my classroom, it's a mess, what's happening? To really start to ask myself, why is this happening? And how can I understand it? So a big thing of being able to really think about the why is it humanizes all of these children, right? It was easy to love Dejeuner. And when she would make a mistake, I'd be like, oh, like, it's okay. So one of the demerits when I was a teacher was an unprepared, which meant you didn't have your homework, but also if you didn't have a pencil. So if you didn't have a pencil, you got a demerit. That's a lot, right? And remember, 3 demerits, no recess. So I really liked Dejeuner, so she forgot a pencil. I really didn't want to give her a demerit, right? And maybe I didn't give her every time. Already 0 tolerance then has failed. Think of Larry, who probably within the first hour of being at school definitely had at least 2 demerits. I taught Larry after lunch. So because I was a social studies teacher, we did lunch duty and recess duty. So because Larry, I had him in the afternoon, he often had so many demerits by lunchtime. So basically he never had recess. Like those of you who work with kids, right? Let's put in the chat how effective that is to not let them play. Right, of course not. And same with Javon. There would be some days where, you'd give him a lot of merits, right? Because he would really like be on and connected. And then some days, kind of like Larry, he would come to class and he would have 10 plus demerits. Now, Larry, if you think about being Larry, what that's like every day, you just kind of give up emotionally to connect to your community because every day is, disappointing, right? Javon did more the roller coaster, up, down, up, down. And so in the world of an 11-year-old, when you get 10 plus demerits, have your lunch recess, your end of school day recess, because I worked in extended year and day school, when that's all taken from you, like, what do you really have to live for, like in the school day? Of course, you're going to tear a poster off the wall out of just the sheer frustration. And so being able to see the humanity of each child, of each family, brought a lot of healing to me as an individual. It didn't make me necessarily at that point a better teacher, right? But it brought a lot of emotional healing to our classroom, at least. And so here I wrote at the end of AmeriCorps, you got to put a little like self-reflection, right, of what you learned that year, what you accomplished. And the other teachers wrote things like, my students like increased learning by like 2 academic years. And I'm like, we're out here just trying to survive. We made it this year. Like I had no idea what to write when it was my turn. I was in the line trying to think about it. And so I wrote, I spent my whole life asking myself, what makes a great teacher? And what I know now more than ever is the best thing about being a teacher is that it matters. And the hardest part is that it matters every day. And every day we're all trying to make better happen. And I really believe that all of you here today, right, you could substitute teacher with whatever it is that you do. And we kind of hit on this a little bit, but to really think about a time where you were short with someone. Like me the other day, I said something kind of snippy to my spouse, right? Interpersonal conflict. That's not in line with who I am, but I just kind of nipped and, you say something that you don't quite mean, right? Or maybe sometimes you feel wronged or someone misunderstood you. What was happening like in your life? Like I know yesterday when I was a little snippy, it was after a long day of seeing lots of clients, right? And doing, you know, what I think was really good clinical work yesterday. But that self piece is that, you know, it is tiring, right? So I was quick to kind of jab at my partner. And so to think about that, those contextual factors as to why the things that happen around us are happening. How do you see other people, right? Because it's easy to see Larry as like being naughty. It's easy to see Dejanay as being like the ideal student. But really to think about how we see others and also how others see us. And so what we want to try to do is a different way of thinking. So let's use when Javon tore the posters and decorations off the wall that my now spouse at the time, my partner and now husband, we spent hours after school. I did like a, you know, very like night at the museum experience. This is what I wanted to do. I was like, if I do something epic, my students will like me. So I set up like these incredible decorations and like they had to crack the code. And I thought like I was teacher of the year. I was like, I should be on Oprah. Javon comes in, over 10 demerits, starts ripping his game. I am like ready to cry. Let's look at that event that happens and how we could think contextually about it. Because when I tell you all the feelings that I felt, if you've got a feelings wheel, take it out, because I was angry. I was resentful. I was so emotional. I really was like already like tearing up, and the class had just started. Right? If we just stop there, Javon's naughty, afternoon detention for sure. Maybe we even take his recess for tomorrow. Like, no, right? This isn't thinking contextually. That's that zero tolerance. That's just thinking about the what that happened and not the why. So, but we have to acknowledge the events that occurred, right? I did work really hard to hang all of those decorations and to plan something really cool. And he did rip them off the wall, right? But this is where step 2, we start to think contextually, is we think about the perspective of the individual. What was it like to be Javon that day, who by 12 p.m. had over 10 demerits? And also, right, not just Javon, but what it's like to be me in that moment, right? What it would have been like for someone, maybe even Javon, right, to acknowledge that it must have taken a lot of work to put that lesson together, right? So both ways. We're looking for those systemic patterns of interaction, right? How, in this case, right, the injured party and the injurer, right? But how the two of us, let's say me and Javon, how do we interact? What about the power we all have in this system, right? Javon doesn't have a lot of power in this system. I do. I have the power. It didn't feel like it, let me tell you, because I was the teacher. How does that power dynamic affect our relationship? Because our relationship some days was wonderful and was truly like one of my favorite students to interact with. And then to go from that to having, you know, your classroom destroyed, like, what does that do to our relationship? Makes it really rocky. But relational ethics, that final piece, helps us understand the distribution and balance of both justice and fairness in these interactions and how to repair rupture in relationships. It is not okay to tear all of these things off the wall. That is not what restorative practices, restorative justice teaches us. That is not okay to do. But if we just say that's not okay and this is your punishment, we're never thinking about why that this happened, the perspective of each party, what it was like to be Javon, to be 11 years old and have had no recess, no outlet, no way to play all day, to have nothing to look forward to. Because remember, you're also trying to earn merits So it's kind of like money, right? Earning positive points. If you earn demerits, like you're operating in the red. So how are you going to earn something to shop at the school store? How are you going to earn the field trip when you're getting these kinds of demerits? It's devastating. So this is where, if this kind of resonates with you, to start maybe thinking about what it might be like to explore. This is just a little sampler today. Right? It's like at the weddings and the cocktail hour, you just get a little bite. This is those, right? This is what we're doing. This contextual perspective is the foundation of restorative justice. This is the way of thinking. Restorative justice is what you do when you think contextually. And there's so many different options of how you can do this. In some private practices and schools, community-based services, is things like calming corners, being able for children to have a spot they can go when they feel themselves becoming activated, maybe even triggered, and that there are calming, soothing things in that corner for them to soothe and cope with. And then when they're ready, to be able to rejoin our community rather than just being excluded. The one thing that I think about a lot is my principal at the time, right, said, the path to college is not through the office, right? So every minute children are out of the classroom, that's a minute of missed learning, and those minutes add up. It's things like having a dialogue just between two people, like how I did with Javon. When I tell you, when he apologized for the first time, and I could tell like he really meant it, not the whole like, tell Ms. Cosme sorry, I'm sorry. And then like, you know, we pretend that that did it. The healing that I felt, it doesn't change what happened, right? That my classroom looked like a tornado had like truly hit it, right? So that's kind of that isolated, targeted dialogue. And for him, there was a lot of power and healing, hearing from me as an adult to also say, sorry for things that I had done wrong and maybe some of those interactions. Like I was quick to kind of raise my voice, and that we know is not helpful to raise our voice. It doesn't mean we don't do it. But the look on Javon's face when I apologized for it, right? What that did for our relationship, the repair, was very powerful. People kind of know those restorative justice circles, the big circles, which are great for big groups. Because the thing is, when this happened in the class and all of these things were torn down, he wasn't the only child in the room, right? There are other children who also experienced that, who felt some sort of impact of that. Not necessarily that they were hurt, but emotionally to have a classmate, teammate, who clearly is distressed. You're seeing your teacher who's clearly upset, right? If we never address what happened, like, are we all just going to move on and pretend it didn't happen? No. That's where something like a circle can be really helpful, where everyone can kind of share, like, what do we need to do to work as a team to make this a safe space for all of us? So when you think about how you can put this in action, I really always say, how can we make it where people can express their emotions, where things are a fair process, where we all accept responsibility and the perspective of each other. And we try to ask relational restorative questions, always looking for the why instead of the what. So this is kind of just side by side, how you can see that contextual framework, how that lines up with restorative justice, right? Being able to always look for the why instead of the what, right? That's the ethics piece. Being able to share with each other how we feel creates systemic positive patterns of interaction. Being able to share how we feel in a way where everyone is heard, a fair process. We use social discipline, like we don't talk over each other, we don't raise our voice. That's that perspective of each individual. And we always acknowledge what happened, but we're always in search of the why instead of the what. I'll leave you all with that this isn't easy, right? There's many things that are challenging. This is really emotional work to think contextually. You really have to try to engage your community stakeholders disengaged members of the system, right? Think of Larry. It's hard to get him on board for even just a targeted dialogue because he feels so disengaged from the community. What is going to motivate him to want to share and talk? And then to actually execute it is hard, especially as a teacher. You don't have a lot of energy, you don't have a lot to give. And it can feel really overwhelming to think in that structural way. Like, how can I create that buy-in where I'm supported to do this? It's just some data that this works, right? Some resources that I can send out. And I am happy to take any questions. You can always shoot me an email if you want to learn more, if you want to connect. Here's my email. That's my website. And that's what I've got. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. It's a lot to kind of sit with, but I hope that that was kind of helpful.
So could I ask a question, Roxana,
and hopefully all the questions.
Well, hopefully people will type questions into the chat box as I'm asking this question. But, you know, what you describe sounds like, you know, you might have a teacher who wants this for their classroom.
Yeah.
What sort of organizational support, though, do you need? Because I have teachers in my clinical practice who don't get a lot of support from their schools and have really kids with really difficult behaviors. So, what, you know, if you have a teacher who came today and says, I really want to try and do more of this, but I need help from my principal and vice principal and student support, how do they, you know, how does this work? You know, how do you get school buy-in?
Yeah, well, I feel very qualified to answer this question, Lisa. Let me tell you, because I'm such a bad teacher. So honestly, everyone at my school, it was like, it's not a joke because like it was real, like knew that my classroom was like a mess. And they were just like happy I showed up every day. When I tell you, I really think the administrators were just like, the fact Miss Kazemi hasn't quit. Like, so when I kind of went to them and said, like, I want to try like just a couple of these things, or like, hey, I know you're ordering, you know, a bunch of these things. Like, if nobody else wants one, I would love to take one of these things. A couple of things that I did that I think just truly helped. Now, was I the most effective teacher? No. So the talented teachers, you know, Lisa, will do this much better than I. But I just said, like, you know, I know that I'm overwhelming you guys, like, with asking for help and you trying to have to take students from my classroom. So we had an email called School Leader Support. So I would email it every day, be like, come help me. And they would come take students. I said, I know you can't literally come save me and come essentially co-teach with me every day. These are some things that I think would be helpful. And I just want to know that it's okay for me to do it, right? So there were a couple bean bags that were being kind of like they were going to get rid of. And they looked a little busted, but it's okay. And I asked the principal, like, hey, like, could I actually just take that bean bag, like, and put it in my classroom, right? So to start just kind of creating that calming corner, that's where I started. I didn't tell them, like, you know, your behavior management system of zero tolerance sucks, because like I didn't have any leverage to say that at the time, right? My classroom was a mess. They were like, maybe try it and it'll actually work. I'm like, I am trying. So I did little things like that was within my control, right? Mm-hmm. So in my classroom, that was then something students had, like Larry loved the beanbag. Larry and the beanbag, that was like his best friend. Like, I said, if you want to work, Larry, on the beanbag, like, go for it. If clearly like sitting at this desk is not working for you, and I don't blame him because it's not comfortable. Like, I'm sitting in truly a very comfortable chair right now. Like, who wants to sit at a desk? Like, yeah. If that'll help you, like, do it. And part of it is I had to let go of some of the rigidity of what I was willing to do, but to also ensure like my school leadership that I'm not like going rogue, right? So I just said, like, hey, could I like actually take this beanbag? And they were like, sure. Like, and I said, oh, like, you know, if you're ever getting another one, like I definitely want one. And then, you know, they got a little money for something and they said, oh yeah, we'll give you another beanbag, right? but they wouldn't have known that was something that I even wanted if I hadn't said, right? And so just being able in these tiny ways to just kind of say like, this is something that I want to do, be able to offer. Like, the beanbag was super helpful. It just created a calming corner where you could go sit and you didn't have to sit at your desk, but you also weren't excluded then from the classroom. Those are little things that I think a lot of times like we can get a lot of school administrators for on board, because we're not asking to change the whole system. We're asking maybe to change like the setup of our classroom. And just some schools, you do need permission for certain things. Like, I said, like, could I hang Christmas lights? So, I had no windows in my classroom. And that's why people said it was like the cursed classroom, because no one survived more than a school year. No one ever made it a full year except for me. But I just said like, hey, like, the fluorescent lighting, I think like is really uncomfortable for some of them. Like, I've got some old Christmas lights at home. Like, is it okay if I plug those in? Like, and they were like, yeah, sure. Like, that's fine. Like, and so I think like those were just like little tiny things I did. Like, did they change my life? No. Did they make me a good teacher? No. I was a good, really bad teacher, but they weren't a threat to the structural system. Though I think there needs to be a threat to the structural system because something's got to change. But in terms of what I could do as an individual, really tiny, those were some things. So I always say, like, if you can start with something like a calming corner or just having dialogue with students, it does take time from your own day, like maybe to pull them from another class, like with a class teacher that you have a good relationship with. Like, I was really close with the art teacher. So she would let me pull kids. So those are a couple of ways like that you don't need a lot of like money, and you don't have to like really radically change anything, and you can start doing some of these things.
Great. There's a question here from Amanda.
Yeah,
Amanda
I
says,
saw Amanda's.
I am the person a teacher will call when a student is being destructive or harmful to the teacher or another student. What are your thoughts on temporary class removal for the student to be able to try to calm down and then return to class? And how can I support teachers at my school in restorative practices?
Yeah, I think one big thing is that they come back to class, right? Like, I think that's like such a big piece. Like, I know, like when I taught high school, for example, like a big thing for some of my students, right, so much different age group, was if they struggled with the course material, it really activated them and they would often become destructive. And with older students, like, they could do a lot of damage. Like, they were strong. So are little kids though, honestly. And so they would be real quick to get removed. But even just kind of saying like, I know that this isn't like you. Like, I don't think this is who in the core of who you are. Like, tell me like what kind of got this going for you. And I think, Amanda, if you even have like a really tiny corner, like where you can make it really comfy, like that can be really helpful. And then to say like, if you can time bound some of it, like I'm here with you to be here for you for the next 10 minutes, or, whatever feels appropriate, you would know best. I just use 10 minutes as an example. And then we got to go back to math. But I'll tell you what, I'll come back with you to math and I'll sit with you in math for another 3 minutes. Just make sure you're all situated, feeling good. So it was like a slow transition out and a slow transition back in. And a big thing I think for teachers, hopefully, Amanda, how they can maybe support you is, I think we try really not to wait until things get to that very destructive level. Like what I talked about, that would happen to me a lot. Like the throwing of things, the like ripping things, often I had students who would fight each other because they would just get so frustrated being together all day that they were like sick of each other. To not wait until it gets to that point. Like the first sign, right? Especially anyone who does like clinical work, right? We talked about like, what are those things that like activate you before you actually are triggered, right? I think that also in some ways can make, Amanda, what you're doing a little easier too, of you're not then getting kids at the peak of the roller coaster when there's no way out but through. right? Of when they're just frustrated. Like, can they go take that break, which does sometimes mean removing yourself from the classroom. I had lots of kids who just said, like, I just need 5 minutes. And they would just go right outside the classroom. And when that became okay for them to do, and I set a little timer, I said, why don't you go do that? They were like, I just am really mad at so-and-so and I don't want to fight them. Like, but I really feel I'm going to. Miss Cosme said, okay, like, thank you. Like, thank you for telling me that, like, that's the feeling that you have, right? Rather than being like, well, why on earth would you want to fight so-and-so, Nina? Like, that is not okay. Like, to be able to be like, you feel like you want to hurt somebody right now because you're so angry. And maybe you can go with Mr. So-and-so, Mrs. So-and-so for 5 minutes, try to calm down and then come back when you're ready. So that way, I hope teachers in turn can also support people like you who are doing that. High flyers. Yes. Yes. Oh,
Okay.
trauma bond, Lisa. Yes,
Roxana,
all of it. It's so good.
thank you so much. That hour went way too fast.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Well, it's important, you know, the work that you're doing is important, and it, you know, it's a lot of food for thought. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you for all of our participants as well.
Yeah,
look for the evaluation link, and I will also send out the recording. All right, thank you so much, everybody.
Bye.